And we're live.
All right. Hey, welcome to the premiere episode of the Omer Q Show. We are live from various undisclosed locations across the East Coast. I'm your host, Omer Qureshi, and I'm joined by my super producer and friend, Marcus Webster. Let's get a shot of the webcam. Marcus, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good. How is everyone out there? I guess I can't hear you because that's the way these things work. But I hope you're doing okay tonight.
We all hope you're doing okay, staying quarantined, staying safe. Um, so just a little bit. It's our first show, so we originally wanted to do something lighter than what we're end up gonna do, but obviously because of the events this week, we have to talk about the insurrection. So today's show, we're gonna be talking about the insurrection, what took place at the Capitol, how it happened, what led up to it, and what exactly happened when the people got inside, and the fallout that ensued. Progressive organizer and OQ Politics contributor Dwayne Paul Murphy will also be joining the show to talk about the fallout and the future of the Trump presidency in the next 13 days and what could possibly happen. But let's just talk. Let's just start the show by talking about the events of January 6th, 2021. So it was supposed to be, honestly, a very boring ceremonial day on the legislative calendar when things started. At 1 p.m. Wednesday, a joint session of Congress was supposed to convene to certify the Electoral College votes. This happens every 4 years. It's supposed to be a very simple process that doesn't even get a lot of media attention because it's so simple. But what happened here was, ever since the election in November, President Trump, even though he has lost multiple times, has again and again stated that the election was stolen from him and he's got his supporters riled up. He's propagated so much falsehood about the election that I believe the statistic was over 37% of Republicans believe that the election was stolen. And it's extremely concerning from just a public awareness standpoint, but strictly looking at everything that went into what happened here, uh, that's the biggest thing that played into this. And again, the falsehoods claimed that this could overturn the results, that Supreme Court cases, that um, even the Electoral College itself, states could override it. But let me just again continue to talk about Wednesday. So Wednesday they convened to count the Electoral College results, and before anyone says anything, no, this was not so the congressmen and women so that the Senate could vote on the electors or on the electoral college to certify it. There's no vote that takes place. It's literally just a count. And this really was only put in after the Tilden Hayes race in 1876, so that states that didn't certify their results there could be a process to actually deciding the end results of what happens in those states. But unfortunately, um, that didn't. But unfortunately, some have propagated that you can use this to decertify an election. Now, that's let me just first explain that's 100% false. Can't do that. It's fake news, as Donald Trump likes to put it. And you saw a lot of people like Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz propagate this, get more people to believe this. And as the date got closer, as Trump's court cases started to get declined, as the Supreme Court didn't give him any favors, as states again and again certified, Georgia obviously was a point of contention leading up to this date. Nothing was going to happen. Nothing happened to help Trump. The only thing that could have happened in his eyes, what they wanted to do was on January 6th, delay the certification through objections, through debate, as long as they could to essentially just elongate it and hopefully get into the next day. Even Rudy Giuliani called people and told them to do precisely that. We'll get into that in a minute. But it was supposed to be a very boring day, but then it got turned into this big thing because online there were many groups that were starting an event, this Save America March, or a lot of people also called it the Stop the Steal rally that President Trump was throwing. Trump supporters from all over the country came into D.C. to protest the certification, to go to this rally, this very large rally with thousands upon thousands of Trump supporters that Marcus was actually at, and he'll talk about later in the show. But there was this rally that was planned weeks in advance, and the purpose obviously was to put pressure on lawmakers to stop the counting and certification and overturn the election, actually, even though there was no chance of that happening. So let me actually take you guys through a very short timeline of what happened. Leading up to it, President Trump claimed that Mike Pence, the vice president who presides over the counting of the Electoral College vote, had the ability to somehow overturn the vote, even though that's not in the Constitution. There's no provision that says that. There's no precedent that says that. It can't be done. And Mike Pence obviously said in a letter that he released that day that that could not be done. When Trump heard this, he actually tweeted about it, and it was a very damning rebuke of Mike Pence himself for a lot of Trump supporters, and this is, I think, what led to a lot of what we saw on Wednesday. So Congress convened around 1 p.m. 1:11 actually. Donald Trump was also speaking at his rally, and he told them there, and I quote, "You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength. You have to be strong. We have to come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully stated." And in Trump's eyes, the electors that are lawfully stated are the ones who voted for him and not Biden. So that happened around 1:11, around 2:07. This is while debates are going on inside the House because there were obvious objections. 2:07 is when the mob actually breached the steps of the Capitol. Now, this mob was actually closer to the White House and the Washington Monument. They actually went all the way to the other side of the mall, and they marched all the way to the other side of the mall in order to get closer to the Capitol. And once they got to the Capitol, they were stopped very unforcibly, actually, by some barriers of police, but obviously not for long, and the mob proceeded to make its way onto the steps of the Capitol. Now, the thing is that usually you're not allowed that close if you're a protest. Protests are never allowed on the steps of the Capitol like that. That, especially large ones like this was. So this was a pretty big surprise for a lot of people as it was happening. But as all of this is happening, there are debates going on inside of Congress. And we have Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley, obviously, saying that there's a way for this to stop. There's a way to overturn the election. They're inside debating about it, telling people this is what we need to do. And we'll get into their motivations a little later, but essentially, as these lawmakers, these GOP lawmakers, are making the case for the overturning of the election, we have Trump supporters, a mob of Trump supporters, of thousands of Trump supporters outside, literally surrounding the Capitol as this is going on, and just getting riled up even more and more the more news comes out. So, again, around 2:24, Trump actually sends out a tweet where he says, quote, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done, and we're going to have to fight back much harder, and Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us," is what he said earlier, and obviously that didn't happen. So then basically what happens around 2:45 to 3 p.m., that's when we get the first sights of people actually entering the Capitol itself, and that's when it becomes dangerous. We had seen before there were people surrounding the entire Capitol. There were people on the steps where, you're not allowed to if you're protesting. People on the scaffolding that's there for President Biden's inauguration. And thousands of people start surrounding the Capitol, and then a few break in. They break glass. They break doors down. And it's very surprising, actually, that this was all allowed to happen. It's an indictment on Capitol Police and everyone else who was in charge of security. So just think about this for a second. You have a mob of supporters of a candidate who just lost his election and who has been propagating for months that he in fact was rigged and robbed in that election, even though no evidence at all that's been presented in court or even to the public really proves that. And you have thousands of supporters of his as the people who are certifying the election that he lost are in, and again, this is a joint session of Congress. The vice president, speaker of the House, all members of the Congress and the Senate are there. Literally, all of our elected officials are there except for Donald Trump. There's a mob outside that's growing more and more resentful and more angry every second that goes by, because they know every second that goes by, they're closer to a certification of result that they don't want, and they've been told is a fake result. So the protesters, sorry, not going to call them protesters because that's not what they are. These insurrectionists go inside and they begin basically looting and disgracing the halls of Congress. They begin, and we have some images on the slideshow of some of the stuff that was happening, and it's just really gross stuff. There's Confederate flags. A Confederate flag was in the Capitol for the first time ever. There's never been a Confederate flag inside the Capitol like this. Even the Confederacy never got that far. So we have these people while the session is going on. The session actually stops right after Ted Cruz speaks because they know there's a security threat because there's members of the public. These insurrectionists have just fought their way into the Congress, into the Capitol. So everyone begins to go into hiding, and as this is going on, we're getting reports that the rioters and the insurrectionists are actually chanting toward getting Nancy Pelosi. Said, we're there to get Nancy Pelosi, get Pelosi. There's reports that people were saying, actually confirmed reports and video where people were saying, let's get Pence. People showed up with zip ties in order to go after the vice president, who up until that morning was an ally to everyone there. But the second that he went against Donald Trump and took a step for democracy, nope, he's the enemy now, and he must pay. That's the thinking of Trumpism. That is what Trumpism is. So around 2:45, House and Senate go into lockdown. 3 p.m. is when gunshots are heard, and that is when there was a woman, one of these insurrectionists, a woman who was shot by Capitol Police when people were trying to break into I believe the House rotunda. And then we had a bunch of tweets from President Trump that were all but helpful. He tweeted things like, "You are very special. You are very good. Please be peaceful." And and he says this thing over and over again. Please be peaceful, no violence. But he said this when they were already inside, when they had already broken inside.
Oh, and he says he loves them too. He said he loved them.
He loves them, and they're special. At that point, Marcus, there's no talk of peace. There's no talk of any of that. It's no longer a protest. At that point, they are breaking into the Capitol to stop and overturn an election. And a lot of people thought that Trump had actually succeeded in what he wanted to do, because what they wanted to do was to delay the counting of the vote, delay the certification. And a lot of people thought this was a way that they succeeded. And we'll get to why they were wrong, and they didn't. But then, as everything was progressing, we found out that there were many weapons, pipe bombs were discovered in the surrounding areas. An explosive device was actually left at the RNC headquarters, which was extremely discouraging, especially if you're a Republican that went along with this. So you know that you're not even safe. And obviously, Vice President Pence went into hiding. And a lot of members of Congress went into safety. Staffers were barricading their offices. You had members of the media actually Skyping in. I was watching PBS as this was happening, and they had journalists actually Skyping in and showing the people coming in. They did interviews with some of these people as well. It was insane. And And what this proved, I think, to even the most staunch Republicans who weren't Trump supporters but went along with it, what this proved was this was a monster they created 4 years ago. They created this monster 4 years ago, and they went along to get along. They get along and went along, and it was a monster they couldn't control. It was a monster they couldn't control, and they let it grow out of hand, and it led to an insurrection, not just on U.S. soil, but an insurrection against our democracy, our republic, at the very highest office of our land. And and again, Marcus, you actually were there. So why don't you actually tell us some of the things you noticed when you were there?
Yes. Uh, yes. So actually, I was there. I wasn't there for the protest. But it was about 2 p.m. I got a notification saying that the Capitol was raided, and I wasn't really following the news that closely on the 6th. But once I saw that, something just told me, Marcus, we got to go there. We got to see what's going on. So I hopped in my car from my undisclosed location near DC, and I drove up, parked about a mile east of the Capitol, and walked up, and I just started. I actually called Omar. I said, "Hey, um, this is actually insane. This is history in the making. There's nothing like this. I've never seen anything like this before in my life." And we actually got on a little bit of a live stream. If you want to drop into OQ Politics on our YouTube page, you can see actually what my reactions to this were live. And For this whole experience, I gathered some photos and videos, uh, and it's just tremendous seeing this. It's a moment in history, not the good kind of history, but it is historic to see something like this in your lifetime. There's if you listen to the older generation, they always talk about the day Kennedy got shot, and I am humbled to be able to see this kind of history, even if it is negative. It's very negative. This is the day that democracy almost shattered. But to be there and to report to people, whether it be one or 100 or 100,000, how many ever end up seeing this in the annals of history, you know, it was tremendous to see how what the result of racism and division. Though that's what we saw. We saw the results of years of racism, dog whistles, and division actually manifested in this mob. And actually, I'm going to cue up a video that I compiled of the different things that we saw during this event. So I'm just going to go ahead and play that. So as we arrived onto the scene, we got to right above the visitor center of the Capitol, and we saw a huge mob on the stairs. And as soon as we got close to it, we saw the barricades were down, and a whole swarm of police were coming from north to south.
Pigmentation. We don't have enough melanin pigmentation to survive in the cities right now. So, like I say, we're not foolish people, okay? You would not let Egypt 4,000 years ago. But they're burning up the melanin right now. That's right! And that's racist. That you want to talk about. Put your China flag on.
Tech triangle right now, man. Guys on the wrong side. Who's making pictures? USA!
So after the Senate side was repelled, the rioters were kicked off of the steps, basically. They didn't have anywhere else to go, but they saw the media right behind the Senate, and they decided to attack the media. Fortunately, they didn't attack the people. They attacked the equipment, and you'll see some looting and some vandalization of the media equipment.
Okay.
But yes, as you can see, I did not go inside simply because I was acting within my First Amendment as a media person, reporting this to all of y'all. But I personally didn't feel comfortable going inside. In my time there, uh, I, I got there about an hour after the initial raid into the Capitol. Uh, and I didn't go on the west side. I stayed on the east side for the entire thing. You'll see on other news sites that the east side was just as bad, if not worse. I witnessed the police come in, and let's just say that they were not treated with the same respect they were by Trump supporters throughout the rest of this year. And I saw a lot of Trump supporters try to break into the Senate side, as you saw. There was numerous amounts of tear gas, and it comes out now, in hindsight, through the news reports, that was Trump supporters throwing tear gas to try to disorientate the cops.
Figures.
And there was numerous flashbangs, which is still undetermined who sent those out into the crowd. But it was a trying experience, just because one, I knew I wanted to be there to see history, but at the same time I was disheartened by what I was seeing. It was just something that I hope I never see again, but I'm glad that I was there to see it firsthand and be able to report it to you.
Yeah, and I remember my initial reaction when I was seeing this stuff happen. When first of all, again, I was surprised that they were able to get all the way to the Capitol itself, or the steps of the Capitol, because you're never allowed to be on there. Like, it's almost never allowed that protests or anything are allowed to be on there in mass. But somehow they got there. They fought their way there. And then when they were on the scaffolding, that's when I became exceedingly concerned, because that's when it becomes, okay, they're definitely not protesting anymore. They're actually trying to get in the building. You could see they were trying to climb in. And again, it was all an effort to try to stop this vote, to try to stop the electoral process, that democracy itself. And we know that democracy at the end of the day won out, but at that time we weren't sure. I just remember seeing this and just being, the initial emotion was shock, obviously, but then it quickly just turned to anger. It turned to anger because what we were witnessing, Marcus, wasn't just a rebellion. It wasn't just a protest. I'd gone out of control. It was a coup attempt. And I don't think, and a lot of people feel very, strongly against using language like that, because They feel like it's not appropriate when talking about the United States, but that's what this was.
Yeah,
They were
and
there to, yeah,
during our live stream, you asked me a question. I was going through the footage today just to prepare for what I would say here, and you asked, what do you think the long term like effects of this would be? Something along those lines, and honestly, I it's strange looking back and listening to that audio from what I was saying, because I mean during the time. I didn't feel like there was a significant threat to my life, but I was definitely in danger. There was a tear gas in my eyes. I felt it. I was crying. There was a lot of, there wasn't social distancing, obviously.
obviously.
I mean, I tried to stay as far away from people as possible, as you can kind of see through the videos, or the videos and through the slideshow. You can see we're not really in the mobs, trying to be responsible with that. But, looking back, oh, and then also, one of the things I noticed just now in the slideshow, there's a photo with someone giving us the middle finger while we're taking their photo. Um, and there were a few times when they thought, we were well dressed comparatively. We didn't have any Trump insignia on us because that's obviously not what we support. Uh, but they they saw us as the media. I don't know if that was because of my complexion or if that was because I didn't see. There it is. There's the photo with the middle finger. But there were a few times
Yeah.
where we were pointed at, where we were, questioned even. But you know, looking back, being outside of the situation, it's just
It's almost like I don't know if you've seen that picture of there's this picture from Nazi Germany, um, and it's the crowd at a Hitler rally where everyone's giving the Nazi salute, and then there's just one person who's not.
yeah.
And it's like, yeah, just stick out like a sore thumb.
And
And
and that's what it felt like. Looking back into history, Hitler did try to take over once unsuccessfully.
yeah, yeah, yeah. This and a lot of people, including myself, have compared this to the beer hall push, because before Hitler actually took power, he tried on a different scale, something very similar to this. He tried to take over in 1923, I believe. Him and Nazi Party officials actually stormed the Capitol building in Munich, and they tried to take over the government right then and there. They thought if they could take over Munich, they would be able to stop the 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 um, the workings of the government in the Weimar Republic and take over. And that's the exact same thing they were trying to do. They were trying to go in there, stop the count, and consolidate Trump's power. That's what this was about. This was about keeping Trump in office. It was about overthrowing our Constitution and our democratic principles. It was not about saving them at all. It was not like people want to say that, this is, people compare this to, other riots, right? And this isn't even, they compare it to especially the Black Lives Matter riots.
Yeah.
And again, I don't like any sort of rioting at all. But there's also an extent where there's different levels to this, and they do exist, because because you have to look at, not just, the fact that they're rioting, but the reason for it. You could say, Black Lives Matter, those riots broke out from protests because there was innocent black people in this country getting murdered by police. This happened because a powerful billionaire got his feelings hurt and lost his power.
Yep.
That's why this happened. There's no justification even for the protest to have taken place in the first place. So, granted the riot, there's no justification for the actual protest that they were there for to take place, because it was actually completely counter to our democratic principles, our republic, and the elections that did take place.
Well, a funny thing that it's not funny, but like it's humorous, like how people try to make comparisons to other protests at the Capitol. Uh, on Facebook, I keep seeing this
Mm-hmm.
one comparing it to the Green New Deal sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office, but that was in the
Oh
House
my God.
office building that's completely accessible to the public, has no sort of like classified information, just no skiffs, nothing like that. But and they were
Mm-hmm.
peacefully in there, And Nancy Pelosi actually welcomed them. I bet she didn't actually welcome it, but she said, "Hey, I will listen to you, and I will,
Marcus,
take your concerns."
Marcus, you know the biggest difference between those two?
One was
One,
legal, the other wasn't,
one,
on a massive
one,
scale.
one of those protests went through security before they went in,
Yep.
waited in line. The other one didn't. The other one broke in.
And the last thing I'll say about that is, I just thank goodness that for some, it's probably an act of God or some kind of divine being that not that as few of these Trump supporters were armed as they were. I think if they were armed as much as they would probably have liked to be, I don't think I would have been alive after going to there.
Yeah.
I thank
Yeah.
God that they were not armed.
Yeah, and just looking at some of the participants that were in this place, like you not only had the Proud Boys who were there, who make up a large chunk of Trump's most vocal and radical base. You had the Proud Boys, a group called the Oath Keepers, which is a far right group, self-identifying members of QAnon. There's this picture of a guy with a bullhorn or whatever going around, and who looks like a barbarian. He called himself the QAnon shaman. Neo-Confederates who were flying the Confederate flags next to statues of Abraham Lincoln, next to statues of abolitionists and Republicans from the 1860s who fought against the Union, or against, the Confederacy. Neo-Nazis, people wearing this deplorable shirt. Like, this was... It's stuff like this. Remember back in the day when Hillary called Trump's supporters a basket of deplorables? And she got a lot of flack, even from people like me. It's stuff like this that makes that kind of stuff sound justified.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like this that makes even people like me who are like, you shouldn't say that because you're not looking at the pain, the economic pain some of these people are in. And granted, some of these people might be feeling economic pain, but they're at this point. This is not justifiable in any way. These people are part of a cult of personality that has just taken over their entire brain. That has just, and they're not able to get out of it. That's the scary part. These people genuinely believe that the election was stolen. They genuinely believe that they are justified in they're justified in stopping what they see as a threat to democracy, what they see as a rebellion from the establishment, when really this is just the electoral process that's been playing out for years and years, ever since this country was founded, going through, and they don't like the result. That's it. That's all this is about. They don't like the result, and it sets a terrible precedent. But we'll talk about that later.
Absolutely.
I think, Marcus, do you have anything to say right now before we go to break?
I think it's been said. That was. I think we covered a lot of the bases there.
Cool. We're going to be taking a short break, but when we come back, we'll Wayne Paul Murphy joining the show to talk about the aftermath of the Capitol siege and what it could mean for the country moving forward. During the break, however, we will be playing a preview of an interview I did last week on the OQ Politics podcast on Puerto Rico. The full version of the episode is available for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts today. Just search OQ Politics and start listening. In the meantime, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever a new video is released. We'll be right back. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Before we begin, I just want to remind you that for updates, be sure to follow us on Facebook at OQ Politics. Check out our new website, oqpolitics.com, for daily blogs, podcasts, and much more. Again, that's oqpolitics.com. And if you like the show, do remember to follow us on Stitcher, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts so you get notified whenever a new episode is released. And finally, support the show by helping it grow. Share it with your friends, your family, just a few easy clicks, that's all it takes. And if you forget anything that I've just said, be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. All right, let's get to the show. Puerto Rico has been a U.S. territory since 1917. Like in states, their residents are U.S. citizens, have the ability to travel freely to other U.S. states, and run for higher office. However, due to its territorial status, the residents of Puerto Rico do not have the right to vote in presidential elections and have no voting representation in Congress nor the U.S. Senate, meaning that many of the issues facing working-class Puerto Ricans are not being heard on the federal level. This despite them paying many of the same taxes that the residents of U.S. states pay. This, combined with years of rampant government corruption, natural disasters that have devastated much of the island's infrastructure, recent calls for statehood, as well as the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, have left the fate of the island's status and the rights of its citizens in doubt. So what can be done, not only to incorporate Puerto Rico, but also help rebuild the island's fragile economic state? Puerto Rican activist John Gonzalez tells us. I'm Omer Qureshi, and this is OQ Politics. All right, John Gonzalez, welcome back to the show, John.
Thank you. It's nice to be back, Omer. How you doing today?
I'm good. Just riding out hopefully the last wave of the pandemic.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Speaking of the pandemic, let's talk about Puerto Rico and COVID-19, because Puerto Rico is actually one of the first places to implement very strict COVID-19 regulations. I believe on March 13th, Puerto Rico closed all public schools, universities. There was an executive order that came out that said that you have to get tested. You have to test negative 72 hours before you get on a flight to come to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico has been at the front of this battle on COVID. Their political positions and the way they've handled it have they've been the first to handle it in the way that they have. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on the island?
Yeah, so Puerto Rico definitely got out in front of this very early. Puerto Rico, as mostly everybody knows, has had its economic woes over the last 10 or so years, and it just simply couldn't afford to be liberal, for lack of a better term, with its policy. It had to shut down. It had to close tourism. It had to close schools, banks. It had to keep people out of hospitals. To date, I believe about 112 or so thousand cases have been reported, and approximately 1,200 or so deaths have been attributed to COVID. So those numbers for an island of 4 million people are not horrendous. They'd strike generally in middle of the pack when compared to U.S. states. Of course, the difference is that a lot of Puerto Ricans don't have the same access to the social safety net systems that people in the mainland have. So people who are impoverished, who struggle with COVID or have other diseases that maybe are comorbidites for COVID issues, won't have the same level of care and or ability to receive that care as even the poorest people in the United States would. So Puerto Rico has been very judicious about its COVID policy. It opened up again to try to maximize tourism dollars at the beginning of the summer, but there were just too many cases of tourists being unsafe and bringing COVID with them, or not complying with local mask mandates in places like San Juan or Mayagüez, where people tend to go. And so the island has been largely shut to tourism. That, of course, it's a tourism dependent economy at this moment. So that hurts the bottom line. And
We're streaming again.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the show.
And we're back.
All right. Hey, 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 welcome back. So, again, joining us right now is progressive activist Dwayne Paul Murphy. He's going to help us break down some of the things that happened in the insurrection. And again, Dwayne, we were just talking about some of the things that led up to the events and them breaking in. What was your instant reaction when you saw what happened on January 6th?
Well, I was just completely shocked, like everybody else around the world. Uh, I mean, this is very similar to what happened with state legislators in Oregon and in Michigan, especially in response to, the COVID-19 restrictions implemented by these states and localities. But this has taken on a completely different animal. I mean, we've always known that domestic right wing to far right extremism and terrorism has always existed. We saw it with Ruby Ridge and the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. There have been increases during Obama's presidency. And now with Donald Trump's short but very polarizing and very divisive presidency, we've had, the Pandora's box is just open and we don't know if we can close it back up. And, it really shows that, almost 20 years after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, it's like this is a matter of national security because if these uh, people, this mob, and 99% of them are American citizens, can easily just take over the majority of the inside and outside of the federal Capitol building in DC. That means anyone could, especially, spies from rogue nations or terrorist groups from, armed guerrillas. We don't know. But that is the scary thought.
Right. And I think the scariest thing of all of this wasn't just, a mob kind of doing this on its own. This was actually this was actually incited by a rally that Trump held on in DC on the same day. And I was talking about that earlier, but just to go over again, at this rally, it was called "Stop the Steal." The Save America March was also called, and I'd been seeing stuff online, and anyone who was really paying attention knew that this was going to be a pretty big thing happening in D.C. on that day. They were planning on having thousands upon thousands of Trump supporters come into D.C., march, protest the election result, and eventually it got to the point where President Trump was going to speak. And when he spoke, he did the same thing he's been doing for the past few months. He just repeatedly stated things that were 100% false, calling the election a sham, saying it was rigged, saying that the Georgian election officials somehow were costing him the election and they were withholding rightful votes from him when that wasn't the case, you know? And these people were propagated this lie that stated the election was stolen from them, and that's what led to this rebellion that in their eyes. You had other people speak at this rally too. You had people like Rudy Giuliani, who's been Trump's lawyer, and he used to be everyone's favorite governor back after 9/11, but now he's just completely ruined any reputation he had. He was out there acting like he was Tywin Lannister from Game of Thrones, saying we need a trial by combat, saying that we need to go in there and have a trial by combat for the election. And when you say stuff like this, what do you expect those people to do? When Trump is saying he's having dog whistles to right wing groups and to nationalistic groups and for violence and to show strength, what do you think is gonna happen? And then speaking of dog whistles, let's talk about Mary Miller. Mary Miller, and this is something that it was happening same day as the Trump sorry, I'm not gonna call them a protest because that's not what they are. They were an insurrection. The same day as the Stop the Steal rally, there was there was another event going on, and I believe it was called like Conservative Moms of America. They were saying they had their own little rally, and it was in somewhat related. But Mary Miller, who is a congresswoman from Illinois. She was newly elected back in November. She said at one point, and I quote, conservatives would lose unless, quote, we win the hearts and minds of our children. This is the battle. Hitler was right on one thing, she said. Whoever has the youth has the future. Now, anytime, I don't care what you're saying, anyone defending her or saying that she was trying to make, an overarching point that's kind of missed by the example she gave, no, you're wrong. That's no, it holds no water. It's wrong. No, it's wrong. What was done was it was deliberately a dog whistle to white nationalists at that rally. And it was a call to people who idolized Hitler. There's no way you're telling me that you couldn't think of a better example of what you were trying to say with someone who's not universally panned as one of the personifications of pure evil? I don't buy it. What she was doing, what many people, what the Trump administration has been doing for the past 4 years, has been propagating and dog whistling to these white nationalist groups, to these racist KKK, white nationalist, neo-Nazi groups. And we saw that. We saw people with Confederate flags. We saw people with just the worst types of shirts, so with Auschwitz prisoners on them. We saw people who were walking the hallowed halls of Congress, where people like Abraham Lincoln served, with Confederate flags and with neo-Nazi, with things that they fought against. We spent years fighting a civil war to put this kind of stuff down. And these are the same people who are flying American flags alongside the Confederate flag, alongside the rebel flag. It's one anyone who truly thinks that this is about heritage, that this is about, an example, or this is about anything, they're 100% wrong, and they're feeding into it. It's the same people who were enabling Trump for 4 years to do this kind of shit. It's the same people who are, in my opinion, and I think the opinion of everyone at this point with a rational thought, is the same people who are complicit in this occurring. And again, you had groups like the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, QAnon people, neo-Confederates, self-avowed neo-Confederates at this rally. And you know what this was? It wasn't just like the beer hall push in back in from Nazi Germany. This was, I think, what we saw was the true, like, if it wasn't already apparent to people, this for everyone was the time where people really saw the fact that there exists this fascist movement in America. Because a lot of people for a long time were like, well, isn't fascism, it's people are undereducated, miseducated, misinformed, you know. And that what we saw there was right out of a fascist playbook. And I just wanted to get some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, let's not forget that fascist movements, especially what we saw in this country right now, it's not just appealing towards, white working class and poor folks in the rural Midwest or the South. These are also people who are middle class and upper middle class, like well off people who live in the suburbs of outside major cities all throughout this country. So they're all united under this front of we have to preserve the traditional America. But people forget that so-called traditional America, or the America of the past, uh, everyone was not included. People of color were not included. Native indigenous peoples were not included. The disabled were not included. Immigrants from the developing world were not included. Queer people were not included. Women were mostly not included. And so, this is, when you take the throwback of that type of nostalgia and put it into insurrectional action, like I said, this type of extremism has always existed for about, I don't know, 40 to 50 years. But ever since Donald Trump was elected president, the cat's out of the bag, in my opinion. And moving forward, after his presidency is going to be over, either through impeachment, removal, resignation, or until Biden is inaugurated, in this age where social media is so prevalent now, I don't know how you could, you know, put everything back in the box or try to control it in either way.
Right. And again, when people sometimes get confused, they're like, "What is fascism?" And you know, fascism really is at its core. I'm just here. I'll do this. I'm gonna give you a characteristic, and you tell me whether or not you could say this about Trump's administration. Strong, regimented society with an economy that appears to be free, but in all intents and purposes is state run and works for the state.
Yes, I do agree that is a pretty clear characteristic
Right.
of fascism.
In Nazi Germany, what did you have? They had factories that were privately owned, but many times were making things authorized by the German government. They were working for essentially the military. And it gave the illusion of a free market, but it was only working for a certain set of rich people. Sounds a lot like the military industrial complex when you think about it. You know? Okay, characteristic number two, the desire to create a stronger society stripped of its weakness that's inherently nationalistic.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that, you know, basically calling out people who are patriotic but are acting in the most undemocratic and liberal
And
ways, and, you know, criticizing people who want, you know, small p progressive changes, you know,
right.
enemies of the state.
But but even it's not even about progressives. It's just, like I said, Trump's rhetoric, even if you look at something like a Make America Great Again, that's saying that we suffer from a weakness and we need to be stronger. That itself is a fascist type of way of thinking. We are a weak society and we need to get rid of this weakness. And many times in fascist societies, the weaknesses are who? Minorities, the marginalized communities in those societies. In Italy, it was Jewish people, it was communists. In Germany, it was many of the same things, Jewish people, gypsies, people of who were handicapped. These are things that have been used, and even Donald Trump, what does he do? Mexicans are rapists. We need to ban Muslims. There's good people on both sides. When he was talking about white nationalists and Black Lives Matter, all of these things are, this rhetoric is inherently fascist, and it's made in the mold of these fascist movements. And I liken it a lot to, there's a lot of parts of Trump's thing that are taken actually directly from fascist movements of Hitler, Mussolini, Oswald Mosley from the 40s. And it's kind of scary when you think about it. Something like fake news. Dwayne, in Nazi Germany, they used to have this saying, and they actually still do in many fringe far right, neo-Nazi groups. They have this phrase. It's, I believe, Lügenpresse, and it translates loosely into the lying press. And what that sounds a lot like fake news. The Nazis adopted the term for their propaganda against the Jews, communists, and to incite fear and to somehow cra- uh, capitalize on people's fear and use them to create what they thought would be a better, more authoritarian state. They did this with propaganda. You know, they hadn't. The Nazis obviously had a very strong grip on the media and the media that they let out. And Trump in his own little media sphere, obviously, other than what he considers the lying press, which is most of mainstream media, he has a very large grip over the strong right-wing media in this country, and they basically follow a lot of his tells. And 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 that gets to the question of, really, who is complicit in all this? Who is complicit in not just complicit in enabling this, but who is complicit in actually carrying this out? And is there a difference between those two?
Well, in regards to, you know, the differences between, you know, the fascism we saw in Europe of the early 20th century and Trump's presidency, that American governmental institutions are much stronger. Obviously, they are
Yeah.
archaic and need fundamental changes, but you have to understand the reason why fascism in early 20th century Europe occurred is because they had the First World War there, and Germany suffered the worst. They had to pay back in the form of war reparations, and their economy and institutions were not strong enough to be a legitimate nation, a legitimate, post World War One democracy or republic at least, or constitutional monarchy if they wanted to. And so that's how people like Hitler and Mussolini took advantages of these power vacuums. In the United States, fortunately, we don't have power vacuums of that certain kind. But what this presidency has taught us is that we cannot take anything for granted, and we
Hmm.
need fundamental institutional and structural reforms to make sure our democracy is further bettered and not further stagnated or archaic either way.
Right. And, I think that Dr. Cornell West, who is, a very, I would say he's one of like my many inspirations as far as, political philosophy and, my studies on politics are concerned. And when he was talking about Trump's fascism, I believe, on the Michael Brooks show once. And he said the difference between fascism or fascists and hypocrites are that hypocrites recognize their shortcomings and then end up going back on their word. Fascists instead will try to go on try to defend their original position and hold to the fact that they were right even when they're completely wrong. You know, it, the fascist or the gangster, like he also called them gangsters. Gangsters and fascists don't have virtues. They they feel this way because it's a sense of it's a sense of multiple things actually. It's a sense of weakness. It's a sense of strength also. And he put it in a lot more beautiful way than I'm putting it right now. But just that idea that in this whole system, in these last 4 years, you could break it down the same way. There are the hypocrites, being people like Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, the opportunists who kind of like went along with the ride of Donald Trump. They went along with his fascist rhetoric because it benefited them in the short term and it benefited their policies. And then as soon as this happened, as soon as this insurrection happened, they went off the train and they saw that something that was even more taboo than they ever expected. They never expected this to get this far, and you could totally see that in the way that they were thinking, even though everyone with rational thought could have seen this coming. But then you have the fascists, then you have the gangsters who don't care. And then that's people like Josh Hawley, those people like Ted Cruz, who, regardless, are enabling this. People like Josh Hawley, when that group was outside the Capitol, when they were where they weren't supposed to be, he raised a fist in support of them. And then that's when I tweeted out a picture and I said the new face of American fascism is Josh Hawley. Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz is someone who for a long time we've thought to be an opportunistic politician who is actually more dangerous because he knows the way politics works, and he's in the same vein. And he sent out a tweet where he was talking about where he was defending his position because a lot of people were comparing this to Nazis and him defending Nazis, and he said in a tweet, and I'll read it right now. Um, Really sad at a time of deep national division, the president-elect Biden's choice to call all his political opponents Nazis does nothing but bring us together and promote healing. Does nothing to bring us together and promote healing. This kind of vicious partisan rhetoric only tears us apart. Which is hilarious coming from someone like Ted Cruz, who aligned himself with Trump. And for the past 4 years, who's been the center of just partisan rhetoric and vicious attacks to the other side. But bigger than that, even bigger than all that, ignoring all of that, Dwayne, those people, those protesters, as a lot of people on the right still wants to call them, These people constructed gallows and tried to hunt down. There's video of them trying to hunt down the vice president and the speaker of the House. Think whatever you want of them as leaders, they still represent our country. They still represent something as far as seats in our democracy. They were trying to hunt them down during a joint session of Congress, because of Trump. And all while this is going on, while his vice president, who he stood by for the past 4 years, said that while his vice president is getting hunted down, Donald Trump is watching this on TV and wondering why people aren't more excited about it, because he thought this was great. And that's it. That's the difference that Dr. Cornel West was getting at. The difference between those who enable and those who are actually at their core wrong, because someone like Josh Hawley still has not gone back on it. Yes, he said there are still protesters, but he still, yes, he said that they were wrong to break in, but he still objected and he still fanned those flames afterwards. He's still aligning himself with the president even after an insurrection. And that's what you need to know about someone like Josh Hawley and people like Ted Cruz. They are not just enablers. They are trying to carry on the legacy, the fascist legacy of Trump, and trying to get this base, this hardcore Trump base that has been fed these lies, that is ready to fight for them.
Yeah, I mean, in regards to, for them to hold on this base, this is very reflective of how the Republican Party and the conservative movement nationwide has been holding on to the space of mostly, but not entirely, but predominantly whiter and older Americans, silent gen, baby boomers, call them whatever you want. But, by holding on to this demographic, God knows how long, they're forgetting that younger generations like ourselves that are more diverse, and we're facing much more harsher economic inequalities than previous older generations. It's like, how can you be this, opposition party or a competing party within a two-party system, or soon to be future multi-party system if we have one in this country? How are you going to do that if you're appealing to, one particular base segment of the population, in which, we're a rapidly aging society, and the life expectancy, unfortunately, of, this type of base is declining because of a whole host of reasons. And, COVID-19, unfortunately, is pushing that over the top. And so, that's the real dilemma of these movements, especially folks who are against this rhetoric and these tactics moving forward.
Right. And I think, just to put a bow on this, at the end of the day, what we saw there was an attack on our country. And it should not be, called a riot. It should not be called a protest gone wrong. And it's important that we call it for what it is. This was an attempt to overthrow our elected government. This was an attempt to overthrow our constitution. In any other country, Dwayne, Marcus, we call that a coup. So I think anyone who's holding back still at calling it a coup or an insurrection or a rebellion, you really need to think about, what if this was Pakistan we're talking about, this happened in? These are things that happen in third world countries. And the last point I'll say before we go to break is, in 1797, President George Washington set an example, and he set a precedent that has been followed by every single politician and every single president in U.S. history up until now, up until Trump, and that many other countries in the West and Europe have been following, and even in Asia have been following this idea of a peaceful transition of power. Before Washington, there really was no person, no elected official who had ever given up power like that, so peacefully, so easily, and made that transition. And Europe followed our example. A lot of the West, Australia, a lot of the West followed our example in that. A lot of the other democracies, they took our lead. And what we just did had all of those countries who followed our example for the longest time, because they were monarchies when Washington did that. What it does is, all of those countries looked at us like we were crazy, and now they know this can happen to them. And that's the dangerous part. That's when we start seeing ripples in democracy worldwide, and we can't have that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And yeah, so we're going to, again, take a short break right now. We'll be back in a little bit. Again, in the meantime, if you, in the meantime, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever a new video is released. We'll be here on the flip side of the break to talk about transportation and end on something very light. Yeah, we'll be back.
And we're back.
All right. Hey, welcome back. Welcome back. This is the Omer Q Show. And next on the docket, we're going to be talking about infrastructure. There's been a lot of news in infrastructure in the past few weeks. Most notably, former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg being named the transportation secretary for the Biden administration. All the while, outgoing Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao, also the wife of Mitch McConnell, has resigned in the midst of the insurrection that took place this past week. So a lot of news on the infrastructure front. And for that, I'm going to hand it over to the president, founder, CEO, and everything else of New Urbanist Policies for Transit-Oriented Qualities, the Web, Marcus Webster. Let's hit it with the webcam.
Hey, the webcam, it's on. But yes, this is also a big year for infrastructure. As you may know, every 4 years, the Society of Civil Engineers, they come out with a grade for infrastructure, and it becomes the talking point for all infrastructure policies that are created in that span of 4 years. As you may know, our current grade is D plus, so we're gonna get reevaluated. We'll see if we went up or down. Uh, my guess would be we went down just based off the fact that Trump didn't deliver on an infrastructure bill in his tenure. He actually, if you might remember, a couple years back, there was that infamous meeting about infrastructure at the White House, where Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Trump all sat down in the White House, and it seemed like everything was going well until Trump brought up the wall and said that the wall would be necessary for the Republicans to come to the table on any infrastructure, and that killed infrastructure for the entire term. But
Marcus, there's only one wall that matters when it comes to infrastructure.
absolutely, it's the firewall. Yeah, that's another video on the Omar Q, the OQ Politics webpage. You'll have to check that out.
You can find that. Marcus was on C-SPAN live talking about the need for a firewall. You can find that in the archives. But yeah, Marcus is right. Infrastructure is a big deal. Hasn't been an infrastructure bill in a very long time.
And the last report that came out from the Society of Civil Engineers said that $4.5 trillion would need to be spent from 2017 to 2025 in order to get infrastructure back to where it needed to be. So we're just digging more and more of a hole, and I'd be interested to see what the rest of the panel has to say.
Dwayne?
Yeah. Well, as someone who lives in a state that is, we have a very heavy personal vehicle or car culture here, infrastructure is very important. And, not just in regards to, making sure we have progressive public sector investments to completely revamp and renew our infrastructure that was built more than 50 to 100 years ago, if not more. There's also a lot of, in my opinion, institutional classism when it comes to accessing tax-funded infrastructure. For example, where I live in South Orange County in Southern California, there's a debate about a toll road through this more inland, hillish area of South Orange County, and people don't want a toll road. But learning about the local debates about what the transportation board is doing and how our city officials are doing, I'm thinking to myself, why do we have to pay for accessing a road that is built by the public through the taxpayers? And people are like, well, there are issues with congestion and traffic. Well, it's like, but we have the scientific knowledge and technology, if not the progressive public sector investment at the state, local, and federal level, to make sure we can reduce those chances in the era of where we're going to have, automation and advances in artificial intelligence, renewable green technologies. Like, we could easily do this, but there's hesitant amongst our leaders, and then the hesitancy trickles down to ordinary folks saying, well, it will cost too much money and there's this and that. But it's like, the cost of doing little to nothing is far much greater than doing something. You know what I mean? Yes, of course,
Absolutely.
It costs money, but in the long term, you'll be saving lives, you'll be saving the environment, and you'll probably save some money all at the same time.
Absolutely.
The thing-
And oh,
No, go ahead.
oh, And absolutely, I think that just comes down to the main point that brings laps it into the news recently that Pete Buttigieg will be taking a transportation secretary position. Is we need someone in those higher echelon level positions who's going to be community oriented. Uh, well, in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the major infrastructure pushes have been towards automobiles. And these freeways that have been constructed have decimated minority communities to the point that they're still fractured. If you look at the minority communities all across America, there's huge highways in between. You don't see that with a lot of the other ethnic groups. They don't have these walls of concrete breaking their communities up, and that'll be something that we have to see. Will Pete Buttigieg be a steward and help these communities by increasing mass transit, and not highways? Will the projects that he does advocate for, will they be connecting minority communities? Because that's another problem, is having transit lines that only go from wealthy to wealthy or poor to poor because of the community pressure.
Well, Pete Buttigieg has the best record of any politician ever when it comes to minority relations. We all know that.
Well, yeah, he absolutely doesn't. But he also doesn't have a record when it comes to transportation at all.
Hey,
Yeah.
if he can lie about having 1,000 co-sponsors for his Douglas plan, I'm sure he can lie about having 1,000 co-sponsors for his infrastructure plan.
And let's not also forget that when he did a massive redevelopment of South Bend, Indiana, there were a lot of people, longtime residents, whether they were, poor white residents or residents of color, they were pushed out of their own homes and their own properties when, gentrification level type development kicked in. And it's like, look, no one is against new development or building brand new things. It's that if other people are excluded, if not pushed out of the communities they want to be in, then it's like, what's the deal with that, And so I think that's been, the debate about it all throughout this country. And, I think there is this, you know, how this exemplifies institutional and systematic marginalization and disenfranchisement against social and cultural minorities, especially against people of color. One of the reasons why communities in the suburbs, whether it's in California and New York, are hesitant about, you know, transitioning towards more a public transportation oriented system, buses, trains, trolleys, walkable and bikeable places that would integrate communities. They always argue not just only about the cost and the time and the pollution and, labor and environmental concerns, but I think there is also in the psyche of a lot of people, especially, white majority state and local governments and some, residents who are well off, you know, probably mostly white, that, we don't know if we want changes in our communities, which is code
Absolutely.
for, well, we don't
Yep.
know if we want, hardworking, patriotic Americans who just happen to be people of color in our communities.
Well, in a lot of public planning circles, that's called "not in my backyard." Not
Mhm.
NIMBYism. That's a huge
No.
problem.
Yep. So, yeah, and that relates a lot to what we were talking about at the beginning of the show. But yeah, I do think that it's weird though. It's weird though. Infrastructure seems to be one of the only things that both sides of the aisle, like Democrats, Republicans, are both incentivized to do. The only other thing they're both incentivized to do at the same level is something like the corruption and collecting corporate money. It seems like right up there. It's like an infrastructure plan. Honestly, it's like the most bipartisan thing, where at least it should be, because it it creates jobs. It makes the overall running of the country easier for them. It makes things more accessible for their constituents. There's no negatives really. The only negative really on when it comes to infrastructure is that when you roll it out, people just think it's boring. It doesn't get the clicks like on Twitter. It's that other things get it. It doesn't get the amount of clout, I guess, in the news. And that's the problem with today's politics. It's just become, oh, can I get into this news clip? Can I get into how many likes is my Twitter gonna get? How many likes is my Facebook Live gonna get? It's not about what's actually good policy. because at the end of the day, that's what voters are going to vote on. If you're a Republican or Democrat, and you bring 500 new jobs because of a new infrastructure plan into your district, that's going to only help you come November. If you make roads more accessible, if you fix your roads, which is like I think the number one complaint. If you ask anyone who's living in a suburbs, what's their number, or even the city, what's their number one complaint to their elected official? It's the roads are shit.
And the
I can't
sidewalks.
drive.
Don't
And
forget the
sidewalks.
sidewalks.
And the sidewalks and the bike lanes. They're all crap. Fix them. Like, their people are getting flat tires and they're hitting potholes. Like, come on. It's not that difficult, and it's not like you have to throw the bank at it either. If you're a conservative Republican and you don't want, and you're fiscally responsible, you don't even have to throw the bank at a lot of this stuff. A lot of this stuff is just easy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And, I think another reason, why people, ordinary Americans, left, right, and center, don't really pay attention to infrastructure because, I get it, there are other issues, but also if you turn on like a public infrastructure or commission meeting at the state and local level, it gets very tedious and very bureaucratic. And a lot of Congress people are like, well, there's all this bureaucracy we have to go through, and some of it is unnecessary. We try to get rid of it, but some people want to keep it.
Yeah.
And so, if we don't find ways to reform our bureaucracies and reevaluate, which regulations work and which regulations just need to be tossed out because they're not working for the 21st century and beyond, then let's do it. And let's also elect people, who are going to be more impacted by this infrastructure issues. Let's get more young people on these infrastructure boards and commissions, more people of color, more women, because they're going to be impacted within our lifetimes when it comes to these infrastructure issues going forward.
Very true. Very true. I think, do we have anything else?
We have the clip.
We have a clip, right. So I think I remember this now. So we have a clip from Fox News. It's actually Fox and Friends, the day after the insurrection at the Capitol. And they had one of them had some very interesting takes on what's actually important and the important takeaway from the events. Let's take a listen.
Okay, we're having a little bit of audio trouble on this one.
All good. But yeah, basically, they spend a lot of this time talking about Mike Pence and Donald Trump's relationship.
Yeah. So if you want to, I'm gonna try something. It's gonna take about 30 seconds.
Okay. But yeah, just let's I think that the thing you get from Fox News is interesting. You get a lot of these people who are just supporting Trump for the sake of ratings. You get people like Tucker Carlson, who is, he's still a backer of Trump.
Okay, I think we got it. Let's give it a try. Sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
You know what?
And
Mike Pence can just
somehow. All right.
Technical difficulties. It happens. It happens to the best of us. It's not as bad as our election night stream. Our election night stream was actually we had some difficulty. We got through it, but we're getting through this now. Don't worry.
All right. We're trying.
We're trying. You want me to throw it? You want me to throw back to it again?
Let's try one more thing. All right.
We'll try one more thing.
I don't know why it's sideways. You know what? I think we can send it sideways. How do you feel about that?
I'll fix it in post.
Yeah, we'll fix it in post. Let's send it in sideways. I don't know why it did that, but let's just do it.
You know what? Mike Pence can just wave that magic wand. It'll all be fixed.
I hope that doesn't taint their relationship because they have been such supporters of one another and been a good team because Donald Trump.
How can it be good after that?
I'm sure it won't be, but I hope that, I hope the president will be able to forgive him because Mike Pence is such a stellar individual. His walk with God is amazing. I mean, he's He's a good man, and both of them have done a lot to help the country. And I hope that they can move forward and move past this, and just agree that there were differences. I'm sure the president feels like I'm responsible for him becoming vice president, so he should have done this for me. But the president, as you've been saying all along, Brian, the vice president has stood by his side and supported him all along the way. So hopefully their friendship won't end after this, for the good of the country.
I bet you it's done.
Yeah, I know.
Is that Fox News is some shit. Fox News just we just had a rebellion and people stormed our Capitol trying to thwart our democracy, trying to overthrow the government, and your biggest takeaway is what's Mike Pence and Donald Trump's relationship status?
Well, they can't talk about it. They can't talk about like the actual news. It's Fox News. They don't talk about actual problems that occur.
I mean, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But it's just like the way she was sounding. It was just like she had shipped them like 4 years ago, and she's just so upset that they broke up. It's like when it's like when people break up in The Bachelor and they start like complaining about it to everyone at lunch. Like, no, I don't want to hear about it. I don't care. It's not the important thing. Like I said, these Trump supporters, they wanted to kill Mike Pence. They were in there to hurt him. So I don't think you're going to see Mike Pence have any love loss for someone like Trump at this point. I think it's their relationship. Yeah, that relationship status is changing the single. Or in the case of Mike Pence,
it's complicated. It's complicated,
It's complicated for the next 13
but
days.
I think it's also a sign that there's just no way to spin it. Fox News is the king or queen of spin, It depends, I guess, however you look at it. They just spin. They can't spin a revolution into
even Brian Kilmeade, whose facial expressions constantly give me night terrors. That dude's scary to look at. But even Brian Kilmeade's looking at her like, that ain't it. They're both looking at her like, it's over. Why are we talking about this? Like at the end of the day, nobody cares. That it's done. In 10 days, however long we have left, Donald Trump, Mike Pence is going to be history. Mike Pence probably after this especially never wants to be in politics ever again. But yeah. Oh yeah. Anyway, I think that's going to just about do it. So, Dwayne, thanks for joining us, man. We'll hopefully have you back again next time for some great talk. Our super producer, Marcus, thank you so much for your service in the technical arts. We love it. We love you. And we will see you all next week for another episode of the Omer Q Show. I'll archives over the next few days. Be sure to check those out if you missed anything. And remember to hit that like button, share the video, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you get notified whenever new video is released. And remember to check out the OQ Politics Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. See you.